It was said by the Wills that the Old Republic was the Republic of legend, greater than distance or time. Its age was unfathomable, and the history of the Star Wars galaxy was dominated by its expansion and development. But as we discussed at the start of our series on the Republic's history, there was a time in the galaxy's distant past before the Republic, before galactic civilization as we know it came into being, before the Jedi even. We've touched on aspects of this ancient history when discussing the histories of the Sith, Hutts, and Mandalorians, but today we'll be doing something different. In this video, we'll be discussing the entire history of the pre-Republic era, from the time of the Celestials and the reign of the Infinite Empire to the depredations of Xim the Despot. Strap in and prepare for a trip to an even longer time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Before we delve into this juicy period of Star Wars history, this video wouldn't be possible without the sponsor of today's video, Private Internet Access. A VPN hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel, protecting your data from those looking to exploit it. Private Internet Access ensures your information is secure with their world-class server infrastructure. To jump ahead billions of years in Star Wars history, one of the most memorable moments of the Clone Wars was Padme's speech. Imagine if you, a good citizen of the Star Wars universe, couldn't watch that speech because it wasn't broadcast to your world. With Private Internet Access, you could watch Padme's speech from anywhere in the galaxy. While they don't have a Coruscant server, they have servers in 91 countries on Earth and all 50 US states, so you can always access the content you want. Private Internet Access lets you bypass region-restricted content from all over the world. Streaming services like Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney Plus have different libraries based on location. Private Internet Access allows you to change your IP address, giving you access to restricted content. With one subscription, you can protect your entire household across all platforms. By using my link, you can grab an insane 83% discount on Private Internet Access, or just $2.03 per month, plus 4 extra months free. It's a fantastic deal for securing your online presence and accessing global content with the world's most transparent VPN. So whether you're looking to protect your data, bypass regional restrictions, or simply enjoy a safer browsing experience, Private Internet Access has got you covered. Click the link in the description or pinned comment to get started today. The history of the Star Wars galaxy stretches back unfathomably far, and defining where exactly it begins is tricky. You could say it began with the galaxy's formation 13 billion years before the Battle of Yavin, or with the evolution of its first sentient species billions of years later, or with the rise of the first interstellar civilization at some unknown date. Of course, we have scant information about all of these events. Many truly ancient civilizations likely rose and fell billions of years before the known era of the Star Wars galaxy, and by the time of the Republic, there wouldn't even have been ruins left to prove their existence. So we're gonna start somewhere else. In fact, we're gonna start after the Republic's fall. After the Battle of Endor, the Alliance to restore the Republic put Grand Admiral Teshik on trial for crimes against civilization. Teshik was the highest ranking Imperial captured by the Alliance after the battle, and it was widely understood that he was being tried in place of Emperor Palpatine, who had died aboard the second Death Star. Teshik was sentenced to death, but before his execution began, he was allowed to give a final statement. He told the court of another time 4 years before when he'd been sentenced to death, and as part of this story, he related a vision he had had during the resultant near-death experience. We recommend checking out the Essential Guide to Warfare to read the entirety of Grand Admiral Teshik's haunting last statement, but for now, we'll just quote the relevant section of it. I didn't lose consciousness. I could still think and see, but I was no longer seeing what was around me or hearing the hiss of my ruined suit. I had a vision. I was shown everything at once. Everything that had been and everything that will be. I saw great beings made of light who could be everywhere and nowhere at once. They were vaster than nebulae and tinier than cells, and they assembled solar systems like children with toys. I saw strange ships made of whirling, tumbling rods and cones, and heard them scream and moan as they shuddered by. I saw great chrome warships whose mirrored hulls turned sunlight into blinding sheets. and black battleships whose spines were crowned with terrible spiked cathedrals. I saw hammerhead battle cruisers burning and slab-sided Mandalorian constructs sparkling with rime. I saw Star Destroyers arrowing through the night and ballisted Mon Calamari cruisers schooling, and fighters of all shapes and sizes swarming. I saw ships that seemed built from clumps of multicolored wire and ones that looked like organs torn from living things. And I knew all these ships were filled with beings whose lives had been given to war. Hutt and Taiwanese, Republic and Sith, Loyalist and Separatist, Imperial and Rebel. I knew it didn't matter who had killed whom, or when, or how, or why. All at once, I understood that those of us born to be sacrificed upon the pyre of war become one when we die, mingled smoke gone up to whatever gods you believe in. For they are the ones who created war, and they breathed it into our hearts when they created us. War was what defined the history of the Star Wars universe, from the dawn of the Republic to the rise of the Empire, and through eras long before and long after. And so that is where our story of the pre-Republic era will begin, with war. In fact, it will begin with the war we've discussed in the past, the war fought between the Tongs and the 13 nations of Gel for control of the planet Notron. For those who haven't watched our video on Mandalorian history, in which we told the full story of this war, the grey-skinned, lizard-like Tongs and the flat-faced Gel evolved on Notron together, but around 200,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, they fought a war of annihilation with each other, each having determined that the planet was only big enough for one of them. At first, the battalions of Gel had the advantage, but the Tong saw a resurgence when the city of Great Gel was destroyed by a volcanic eruption. In the end, however, the Gel rebounded and the Tongs were exiled from Notron, beginning a long exodus across the stars. The Gel took Notron for their own, and over time they came to be known by another name, humanity. In the absence of the Tongs, these early humans began to advance and develop their homeworld. As they developed spacecraft and began to explore other planets, the great cities of Notron expanded until they had spread across the entire surface of the planet. In time, the planet itself was renamed in honor of the city's appearance from orbit. It became known as Coruscant. By 90,000 BBY, the city had begun to build upon itself, becoming the multi-leveled Ecumenopolis that would later act as the capital of the Republic. But as Coruscant's galactic city steadily grew, other powers were at work in the greater galaxy. One such species surveyed Coruscant in 100,000 BBY and deemed it a primitive disappointment, while another visited 10,000 years later and helped the humans improve the city's infrastructure. These peoples, the Colomai and the Gree, had advanced technology beyond the imagining of these early humans, and they weren't the only ones either. In fact, there were a number of advanced interstellar civilizations active in the galaxy in the early pre-Republic era, 4 of which are particularly significant. These 4 were the Gree Empire, the Kwa Holdings, the Colomai, and the Sharu civilization. Each of these civilizations were deeply alien to each other, with different societal structures, technology, and ideologies, and their respective territories were spread fairly far across the galaxy with no overlap. We'll start with the Colomai, who had the simplest story of the bunch. Hailing from the core world Colomus, a low-gravity planet, the Colomai were incredibly intelligent beings with big heads, big brains, and even bigger egos. Their brains had 4 cerebrums and over 100 lobes, and as a result, Colomai were extremely intelligent, hence their early and rapid technological advancement. They developed their first technological civilizations 2 million years before the Battle of Yavin, and by 100,000 BBY, they had developed advanced forms of interstellar travel and were sending scouts to map the far corners of the galaxy. The Colomai could have conquered a large part of the galaxy, but they had no interest in doing so. They scouted countless worlds with intelligent species, among them Coruscant and Duro, but everywhere their scouts went, they found nothing but disappointment. The Colomai didn't want to bother with sentience that was so primitive from their perspectives, and most planets had stronger gravity than their homeworld, which would have made settlement on other worlds a challenge. Due to this, and other pressures we'll discuss later, the Colomai returned home to Colomus and spent the pre-Republic era keeping to themselves, developing a fairly peaceful society governed by a planet-wide direct democracy. The eventual rise of even more advanced civilizations only encouraged the Colomai's isolationism, which didn't end until the time of the Republic. Next up, we have the Sharu of Rafa 5, an obscure humanoid species from an even more obscure planet. Rafa 5 was located on the far eastern edge of the Outer Rim in what would later become the independent territory known as the Centrality. Their civilization's core territory roughly corresponded with the future borders of the Centrality, though at their height, the Sharu spread all across the galaxy, with possessions as remote as Argao in the core worlds. The nature of their empire and activities is unknown. The Sharu left few records for the younger races to uncover, and they themselves seem to have erased all trace of their presence across much of their former territory in the distant past. All that is known for certain about the Sharu is that wherever they went, they erected enormous, nigh indestructible plastic pyramids, which were particularly common on the planets of the Rafa system. We have much more definitive information about the Gree. These grey-skinned cephalopods came from a remote planet also known as Gree, which was inhospitable to humans. The Gree were one of the galaxy's first spacefaring species, and in these ancient days, the Gree Empire stretched across the northern fringe of the galaxy. The Gree's actual area of influence was much larger, and at the height of their power, they had a presence as far south as Coruscant. At their height, they traded with many less advanced species, though they had a policy of never giving their technology to other species unless that species was theoretically capable of figuring it out on their own. In later periods though, the Gree were isolationist and could sometimes border on xenophobic, particularly during what they called the Orange Conic Era, which overlapped with the time of the Republic. The Gree civilization actually still existed by the time of the Clone Wars, though by then it had been reduced to half a dozen planets in the remote Gree Enclave, a shadow of its former self. But at the Gree Empire's height, the Gree were one of the most powerful species in the galaxy. Their technology was incredible, more advanced than even Imperial era tech in some respects, with the Gree having mastered quantum technology, dimensional physics, and stellar engineering. Their computer technology in particular was incredibly sophisticated, with Gree navicomputers able to chart paths through even the densest asteroid fields and the most tangled nebulae. Many of their devices emitted music when operated, and the skill in operating them came from knowing how to play them properly. At its height, the Gree Empire maintained vast legions of war droids, incredibly intelligent AIs that had to be safely contained within strange artifacts, advanced solar sails, bioengineering technology that the Gree used to reproduce, and a litany of xenoforming devices that included artificial organisms made to transform planets to suit the needs of the Gree. The most fundamental piece of Gree technology was the Hypergate, which created portals through hyperspace for instantaneous, faster-than-light travel. Gree society was built around a system of 4 castes. The first caste was the Crafters, who were responsible for creating everything from instruments to cities. There were also the Researchers, who developed new technologies. The Operators were the ones who controlled the secrets of operating Gree technology, while the Administrators were responsible for government and politics. No Gree had a role in menial labor or combat in the old days of their empire. Such tasks were relegated to droids. Originally, these castes were considered equal, but as the Gree Empire grew, power was slowly consolidated in the Operator caste as the Gree increasingly worshipped and became reliant upon their technology. The Operators themselves worsened this trend by jealously guarding the secrets of their technology to increase their social standing, something that eventually led to the decline of the Gree Empire. The Gree repeatedly came into contact with the last of our early empires, the Qua Holdings, ruled by the Kwa of Dathomir. The Kwa were a species of telepathic, blue-skinned Saurians whose territories bordered the Gree Empire to the south, known for their benevolence and the great architectural works they established on planets within their territory. Like the Sharu, the Kwa were known for building pyramids, and like the Gree, they built hyperspace portals that allowed for instant travel between planets, which they housed within star temples. But these infinity gates were not simple pieces of technology like Gree hypergates were. Rather, they worked by channeling what the Kwa called the power of the cosmos, what other peoples knew as the Force. The Kwa were one of the first species to discover, study, and harness the Force, and as they spread across the galaxy, they made it their mission to spread knowledge of the Force to the younger species. But all of these species were surpassed by the Celestials, the most widespread and powerful of all the ancient great powers. These ancient beings, also known as the Architects, are hard to describe. Their true nature was impossible for mortal beings to understand. Some stories claimed they were shapeshifters with no true form. Others said that they were discorporate entities that had become part of the Force itself. Some archaeologists noted that species that were believed to have had contact with the Celestials tended to depict them with a motif that could be interpreted as serpents, vines, or tentacles, but the meaning of this is unknown. Whatever their exact nature, they were beings of immense power, especially in the Force. Circa 100,000 BBY, the Celestials established themselves as the masters of the galaxy. The Kolomai and the Sharu retreated to their homeworlds for fear of the Celestials, with the Sharu buying all their technology and using an artifact called the Mind Harp to forcibly devolve their species to a less intelligent state to avoid attracting celestial attention. The Gree and the Kwa, on the other hand, became client species of the Celestials, assisting them in enormous construction projects and adapting some of their technology for their own use. The species that was most involved with the Celestials, however, was the Killiks. These hive-minded insectoids were native to the planet Ouroboros, later known to humans as Alderaan, and they lived in enormous communal nests, each of which had its own specific purpose. Killiks were extremely tough, and like many real insect species, most of them were female, with males only required for reproduction. Killik females could lay up to 1,000 eggs in a month, allowing the Killiks to dramatically grow their population very quickly. The Killiks were a true hive mind, with a collective memory stretching back millions of years, and they could use pheromones to assimilate beings of other species into their nests. These joiners became part of the hive mind, telepathically sharing their memories and skills, all the Killiks of their nest. The Killiks were another early spacefaring species, and at some point, they established a colony on the nearby core world of Alsakan. They, like the other early spacefarers, attracted the attention of the Celestials, who conscripted the Killiks as laborers, putting entire nests to work on enormous projects. Killik hives were seeded across the galaxy during the pre-Republic era. Notable Killik incursions occurred on Sarafor, ancient Korriban, and across the unknown regions. Some of these incursions were at the Celestials' behest, while others were independent actions. With the help of hordes of Killik laborers, incomprehensibly powerful technology, and the Force, the Celestials built incredible constructs, from powerful works of technology to entire star clusters. The Celestials built the Corellia system from scratch, pulling a star and 5 terrestrial worlds through hyperspace and assembling them into a single system for reasons unknown. The unusually dense Hapes and Kron clusters were believed to be celestial constructs due to their seemingly artificial nature, particularly that of the Ossus system, a binary system in which the planet Ossus orbited its parent stars in an anomalous figure-8 pattern. The remote and tangled Cathor Rift was another celestial construct, as was the planet Kessel, the Voltar system, and the Aur Diamonds, terrestrial-sized planets in the Aur system made of solid diamond, believed to have once been the cores of gas giants. The Celestials were also credited for the creation of the Siratu spheres. A system of 6 planets of rock and iron honeycombed with labyrinthine passages, the Dacian clockwork, an immense metal ring around the star Dacian Major, the Pangolin shards, a cloud of metal fragments believed to be the remnants of what we would call a Dyson sphere, the Quinitard, a cluster of 5 stars that orbited each other in the midst of a great stellar void, and the Eonine ring, the scorched remnants of an artificial ring orbiting a planet with a surface made of glass. The collective memory of the Killik Thorith Hive recalled many other ancient projects of the Celestials, among them machines they remembered as the World Puller, the Still Curtain, and the Chasm of Forever. But the most important celestial constructs dwarfed all of these combined. These were the hyperspace barriers that surrounded the galaxy and cordoned off the unknown regions, which were established for some unclear purpose. It's possible that the Celestials created the circumferential hyperspace barrier to protect the galaxy from outside threats, or to protect the outside universe from threats contained within the galaxy. The barrier across the unknown regions was believed by some as a means of containing either the Nal or the Rakata, though it was also theorized to have just been a byproduct of the creation of the circumferential hyperspace barrier, which was speculated to have been built using energies from the galactic core. The later hypothesis, at least, explained why the unknown regions barrier had degraded over time while the circumferential barrier had not. The motives of the Celestials, like the architects themselves, were unfathomable to ordinary beings, but we at least know more about one particular family of Celestials, the Ones. The Thorith, the oldest of the Killik hives, recalled that the Ones were what the Celestials became, which could be understood to mean that the Ones were how the Celestials manifested themselves, or that the Ones were examples of what the Celestials evolved into. The Thorith believed that the Ones coalesced out of a geyser on a tropical world a million years before the Clone Wars, but the accuracy of this story is unclear. The Ones had tremendous power in the Force, and they embodied aspects of it and the living things that generated it. The daughter embodied the nobler aspects of living beings, particularly knowledge, patience, and self-sacrifice, while the son embodied the more animalistic, selfish aspects, among them ambition, impatience, and passion. The two were kept in balance by the father, who could be understood as an embodiment of the will of the Force. For time immemorial, they kept to themselves on a remote jungle world, where they were eventually joined by a mortal woman, who initially became the servant and later took a new role as the mother. But the mother was mortal, unlike the Ones, and as she grew old, she became afraid of losing her family. To that end, she drank from the font of power, the source of the son's strength, and bathed in the pool of knowledge, the source of the daughter's wisdom. Thus, she became Abeloth, the bringer of chaos, an abomination with fearsome power. The Ones abandoned their original homeworld to Abeloth and relocated to Mortis, a parallel world with strange properties, but before they did, the daughter and the son recruited the Thorith to imprison Abeloth to protect the rest of the universe. To do so, they built a set of enormous world pullers, as the Killiks called them, enormous constructs that could pull celestial bodies through hyperspace. At least 3 were built, and they were used to create a cluster of black holes around Abeloth's planet. This cluster, which in later days became known as the Maw, cut Abeloth off from the outside universe. The prison was maintained by 2 of the 3 world pullers. One of these, Sinkhole Station, was located inside the Maw and maintained the cluster from within, while the other, Centerpoint Station, was stationed in the Corellian system and maintained the cluster from the outside. The 3rd world puller, the Cosmic Turbine, was left in the Voltar system. Once all of this was complete, the son and daughter left the Thorith and rejoined their father on Mortis, where the 3 of them remained for tens of thousands of years, influencing the current of the Force. All the while, the other Celestials continued to manage the outside galaxy with the help of their client races. Until the rise of their first true challenger, the only known action of the Celestials after the imprisonment of Abeloth was enforcing the Great Migration of the Killiks. The Killiks served the Celestials for untold thousands of years. At some point, however, the Celestials became displeased with the Killiks for reasons unknown and relocated them all to new colonies in the unknown regions. The Killiks were forced to abandon their old homes on Alderaan and Alsakan, which were mostly long vacant by the time humans arrived on those worlds. For millennia, the Celestials and their servants, the Gree, Kwa, and Killiks, ruled all of known space, but there were still other powers at work during their time. On the icy planet Ando Prime in the year 37,453 BBY, monks of the Order of Dai Bendu discovered a monumental pyramidal ship half buried high in the frigid Andobi Mountains. They meditated on it for generations, naming it the Tho Yor. The origins of the Tho Yor are completely unclear, though given that the Kwa were familiar with their purpose and how they worked, it's possible that they had some sort of hand in their creation. Regardless, 1,000 years after the monks on Ando Prime discovered it, the Tho Yor came to life. This was a process repeated on 7 other worlds where Tho Yor were located. On each of these worlds, in 36,453 BBY, the Tho Yor opened and sent out a telepathic message to all on each planet who could hear the Force, inviting them to come inside. Once the Force sensitives had heeded the call, the Tho Yor took off and headed to other worlds, gathering beings of many species, all of them strong in the Force, having discovered it themselves or been taught to use it by the Kwa. After all had been gathered, the Tho Yor travelled into the deep core to the planet Tython, where they landed, disgorged their passengers, and became dormant once more. The passengers emerged on a beautiful planet rich in the Force, one of the most potent Force nexuses in the galaxy. The passengers joined forces, pledging to study Tython and, through it, the Force, synthesizing the teachings of their various Force-based traditions into a single order. These students of the Force called themselves the Jedi. Tython was a world rich in the Force in all of its aspects, and in the beginning, the Jedi sought to understand and balance them all. Their ranks were composed of beings from dozens of species, each with their own Force traditions. The traditions and beliefs of the Order of Dai Bendu formed the core of Jedi philosophy, but influences from all the others were incorporated as well. Over the millennia, the Jedi began to develop a deeper understanding of the Force as they studied Tython, though their understanding would remain incomplete until the Order met its end. Tython was a place of diverse ecosystems, ranging from vast deserts to lush forests, and a great many animal species lived there. It was strongly in tune with the Force, and when disturbances in the Force occurred, such as the arrival or deaths of a great many Force sensitives, Force storms occurred, extremely dangerous meteorological phenomena that caused lightning storms, earthquakes, and high winds. Tython was also influenced by its 2 moons, named Ashla and Bogan, by the early Jedi. Ashla shone bright white in Tython's night sky, while Bogan, which had a less reflective surface, appeared shadowy and mysterious. The Jedi often meditated on these moons, which strongly influenced their initial conception of the Force. Over the course of generations, those brought to Tython became the Tythons, a new hybrid culture. At first, the Tythons were all strong in the Force, enabling them to survive the planet's dangers, but as centuries passed, non-Force sensitives started to be born to the Tythons, and Tython proved too dangerous for them. Over a millennia after the Tho Yor arrival, this led to the second migration, which saw the non-Force sensitives of Tython relocated to other planets of the Tython system. Some moved toward the system's star, settling on Sunspot, Maltera, Nox, and Krev Koer. Others moved outwards, settling on Kalamar, Shikakwa, Shagora, the moons of Obri and Mar, and distant Fury's Gate. These worlds each developed their own cultures and civilizations, many of which were characterized by resent and distrust toward the Jedi and their strange powers. The Jedi regularly visited the other planets of the system, looking for Force sensitives to bring back to Tython. There, the Jedi built 9 great temple cities, each of which came to specialize in a different part of Jedi training. The youngest Force sensitives would go to Padawan Kesh, the Jedi Academy, where their minds would be opened to the Force until they became ready for a master to take them as an apprentice. Near Padawan Kesh was Bodhi, the Temple of the Arts, and Mahara Kesh, the Temple of Healing. There was also Qui-Gon Kesh, the Temple of Force Skills, Stav Kesh, the Temple of Martial Arts, and Ver Tepe, the Forge, where the Jedi made swords imbued with the Force. Near Ver Tepe were Kaleth, the Temple of Knowledge, Anil Kesh, the Temple of Science, and Akar Kesh, the Temple of Balance, the most sacred spot on Tython. Jedi initiates spent their first years learning at Padawan Kesh. As adolescents, they would be selected for training by Jedi Masters and would be given the rank of Padawan. Once their time at Padawan Kesh was finished, Jedi would become journeyers tasked with traveling across Tython to learn at each of the 9 temples, a pilgrimage that took 2 years. Once this pilgrimage was complete, journeyers became Jedi Rangers, who undertook missions to the other settled worlds of the Tython system on behalf of the Jedi Council. The greatest of the Jedi were the Jedi Masters, the foremost of whom were the 9 Temple Masters, each of whom oversaw one of the 9 temples and who together formed the Council. For thousands of years, the Jedi studied the Force, seeking to understand it through meditation on Tython. They learned how to wield the Force, and the planet itself taught them much of how the Force interconnects all life. But the Jedi understanding of the Force was imperfect. They observed the existence of the light and dark sides of the Force, which they named the Ashla and the Bogan after the Tython moons, but they also believed in a third aspect of the Force, the Bendu, or the balance. The Jedi understood the will of the Force enough to see that it sought balance in the Force, but they misunderstood this to mean balance between the light and dark sides of the Force, between Ashla and Bogan. The Jedi sought to balance themselves between Ashla and Bogan, and they sentenced Jedi who believed strayed too far to either side to exile on one of the planet's moons. This misconception would eventually prove disastrous, but due to Tython's isolation, the Jedi were nonetheless able to persist in relative stability for millennia. For 10,000 years, Tython and the settled worlds remained in their own little bubble, cut off from the rest of the galaxy. But the system still saw plenty of activity, especially as its non-Jedi population grew. Several wars were fought between the settled worlds, which usually ended with Jedi intervention. The last of these, the Despot War, was fought in 25,805 BBY between the Despot Queen of Shikakwa and the Jedi. But even as wars raged in the Tython system, the Jedi and their wayward children were nonetheless sheltered from the far bloodier wars playing out in the greater galaxy. Around the same time the Jedi Order was being established on Tython, the Qua were continuing their mission of bringing knowledge of the Force to the peoples of the galaxy. As they expanded their network of infinity gates, they encountered hundreds of strange new worlds and hundreds of new sentient species. One of the planets they discovered was a tropical planet in the Stellarpore region known as the Tempered Wastes, west of the galactic core. This world was known as Lehon to its inhabitants, a species of lean humanoid amphibians with stalked eyes, tall craniums, and sharp teeth and claws. The Rakata. The Rakata were an extremely aggressive species, cannibalistic and prone to infighting, and the Qua hoped that by teaching them to use the Force, they could help the Rakata become less violent. Their hopes seemed to be backed up by the Rakata's eagerness to learn from the Qua, and by the fact that the Rakata were, as a species, strongly connected to the Force. Nearly every single one of them was Force sensitive, and the use of the Force came readily to many of them. The Qua taught the Rakata to harness their latent Force abilities, and they also taught them doctrines of balance in the Force. However, the Qua, like the Jedi, had an incorrect understanding of what balance in the Force meant, and this had disastrous consequences for the entire galaxy. In pursuit of this false balance, the Qua introduced the Rakata to both the light side and the dark side. To their horror, the Rakata immediately gravitated strongly toward the dark side, discarding any notion of balance and slaughtering any among them that didn't embrace the dark side. The dark side further amplified the Rakata's violent tendencies and hunger for power, making them even more aggressive and instilling in them a desire to conquer. Under the influence of the dark side, Rakatan society transformed and advanced rapidly. The Rakata appropriated many kinds of advanced technology from the Kwa, and their tribes even united under one banner. Eventually, the Rakata demanded that the Kwa hand over the secrets of their infinity gates, and when the Kwa refused, the Rakata turned on them, brutally slaughtering the Kwa and devouring their corpses in the hopes of gaining their powers and knowledge. The Kwa were forced into a brutal war with the Rakata, in which countless Kwa sacrificed themselves to keep the Rakata at bay, while others worked to dismantle the infinity gates that had been built on Lehon. This left all the Kwa that remained on Lehon trapped and at the mercy of the Rakata, who eventually murdered them all. Their sacrifice wasn't completely in vain. The Rakata were, in the end, prevented from learning the secrets of the infinity gates. But the damage had already been done. The Rakata developed other forms of interstellar travel, and they soon spread out from Lehon anyway, seeking new planets to conquer. The Kwa had unleashed the Rakata upon the galaxy, beginning a reign of terror that would last 10,000 years. The Rakata combined the power of the Force with advanced technology, creating fearsome machines that drew power from the dark side. Many of these Force-powered inventions were the first iterations of technologies that would go on to see widespread use across the galaxy, including holocrons, droids, starships, energy shields, energy weapons, and most importantly, hyperdrives. It was the last invention that allowed the Rakata to spread out from Lehon, despite having lost the war for the Infinity Gates. The Rakatan hyperdrive worked similarly to its modern counterpart, but with two key differences. It was Force-based, and it worked by homing in on worlds with strong Force signatures. But this suited the Rakata perfectly fine. They only cared about Force-strong worlds anyway, and their hyperdrives allowed them to spread across the entire galaxy looking for them. The Rakata quickly discovered routes to nearby Force-rich worlds in the unknown regions, which they brutally conquered, enslaving or exterminating their populations. Those who survived came to fear and revile the Rakata, whom they knew as the Builders. By 35,000 BBY, the Builders had conquered all of their neighbors in the unknown regions, and the Rakata ruling castes declared that they would conquer first the galaxy and then all the universe. The reign of the Infinite Empire had begun. The Infinite Empire of Rakata was, in its time, one of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, and many kinds of Rakatan technology were beyond the understanding of even Imperial-era scientists. The Rakata built computers with extremely advanced AIs and self-repairing nanotechnology, the latter of which also saw use in many other major Rakatan constructs, allowing them to survive autonomously for tens of thousands of years. The Builders developed mind prisons, which imprisoned sentience's consciousness for eternity, and terraforming devices called Builder Forges that manipulated the Force to alter the evolutionary paths of life forms on a planetary scale. Many of their war machines were powered by Force-sensitive slaves, whom the Rakata harvested from conquered worlds and placed in machines that amplified their fear and hatred, turning them to the dark side and then drawing on the dark side within them for power. Billions of enslaved Force sensitives became living batteries in Rakatan ships and space stations, trapped in a torturous existence between life and death. Of course, the Rakata also developed more conventional technology as well. They had legions of war droids, vast autonomous walkers, and fleets of warships and starfighters. Many Rakatan warriors wielded Force sabers, lightsaber-like weapons that channeled the raw power of the dark side into a burning blade of frozen fire, while others used powerful battle wands and vibro swords. Hyperspace-capable skip ships were constantly scouting new worlds to conquer, and enormous orbital factories were constructed above the worlds that had already been conquered, sapping them of their resources. The Rakata were frighteningly efficient in how they harvested every available resource they could for use in the Infinite Empire's war machine, from sentient beings to natural resources. As one of the many species enslaved by the Rakata observed, the builders did not touch the stars. They lashed them to millstones. Rakatan society was primarily divided between two castes: the priest caste, which ruled the Infinite Empire, and the warrior caste, which enforced the dictates of the priest caste. Rakata of both castes were all force sensitive, but they were trained to use the force in different ways. Members of the warrior caste used the force solely for offensive purposes, using it to power their force sabers and fuel their battle fury, while priest caste Rakata were trained in a much wider variety of force techniques, particularly those required to use Rakatan high technology and run the Infinite Empire. Within the castes were a number of ranks, of which only 3 are known: Sub-Praetor, Praetor, and Over-Praetor, all ranks restricted to members of the priest caste. Praetors were warlords responsible for managing planets and regions within the Infinite Empire, while Sub-Praetors presumably oversaw smaller territories. The title of Over-Praetor of the Infinite Empire was given to the highest-ranking warlord of the Builders, who ruled the Empire from Lehon. But though the Rakata were the masters of the Infinite Empire, they were a tiny minority of its subjects. The vast majority of beings under the rule of the Infinite Empire were non-Rakata slaves. All non-Rakata in the Infinite Empire were slaves, and all slaves of the Builders were treated miserably, put to work stripping their own homeworlds of natural resources or building temples and monuments to the Infinite Empire. The Rakata would often massacre non-force sensitive slaves on a whim, seeing their lives as utterly worthless. In some instances, the slave workforces assigned to build particular monuments would all be executed at project completion just as a matter of course. The bodies of dead slaves were often eaten by the Rakata, and Rakatan warlords would sometimes kill slaves just for the purpose of feasting on their flesh. More important to the Builders were their force-sensitive slaves, who were somewhat valued due to how important they were to the functioning of Rakatan technology. Many of these force sensitives were used as batteries in Rakatan machines, but some were instead employed as force hounds, hunters tasked with locating new force-strong planets for the Builders to conquer. The Infinite Empire quickly expanded across much of the galaxy. Its first conquests were in the unknown regions, where they expanded out from the tempered wastes to establish the Rakatan Archipelago, a network of a dozen or so Rakatan colonies located near Lehon. From there, the Builders conquered worlds across the unknown regions before eventually spreading out into the eastern slice of the galaxy. In this, they were opposed by the Celestials, and some have speculated that the hyperspace anomalies that cut the unknown regions off from the rest of the galaxy were meant to stop the expansion of the Rakata. If this was indeed the case, it didn't work. As the Infinite Empire expanded across the galaxy, it encroached on the Celestials' domain. The Celestials and their client species worked to contain them, but the Rakata responded with brutal, uncompromising war. The Builders fought a millennia-long battle with the Architects for control of the galaxy, which lasted for a large part of the Infinite Empire's first 5,000 years. They exterminated Killik hives and obliterated Gree armies, and they conquered hundreds of planets all over the galaxy to fuel their war machine, enslaving species, strip mining resource-rich worlds, and terraforming planets like Kashyyyk to act as agri-worlds. By 30,000 BBY, the war was over, and the Rakata had won. The Celestials, those godlike beings who had rearranged the stars and walled off the entire galaxy, vanished entirely. Whether the Rakata somehow slaughtered them all, or whether the Celestials fled, either beyond the galaxy or to some other dimension, is unknown. The ancient grimoires of the Gree Empire claim that the Rakata, who the Gree knew as the Soul Hunters, the Hollowers of Beings and the Eaters of Worlds, unleashed terrible curses upon the Celestials that destroyed their works and heralded their defeat, named the Grey Swallowing and the Faceless Mouths by the Gree. No one knows what exactly any of that means, the Gree of later generations included, but it sure sounds ominous. But regardless of how it happened, the Architects were overthrown and the Builders ruled the galaxy. The victorious Infinite Empire showed no mercy to the Celestials' former servants, waging wars of conquest against each of them. The Killiks were driven into exile and the Gree Empire was utterly defeated, reduced to control of a small star cluster on the northern edge of the galaxy. But the worst fate was reserved for the Qua, the former mentors of the Rakata. The Infinite Empire annexed the Qua holdings and enslaved the Qua, treating them so brutally they devolved into the non-sentient Qui. Dathomir became one of hundreds of worlds ruled by the Builders, and its native rancors were transported across the Infinite Empire by the Rakata, who were fascinated by the beasts and even brought a population of them to Lehon for study. By 30,000 BBY, the Infinite Empire had triumphed over all of its rivals, becoming the ultimate power in the galaxy. With their enemies defeated, the Builders put their slaves and industry to work, constructing their most fearsome creation yet. This was a tool of unstoppable conquest, part battle dreadnought and part spaceborne factory, a fearsome symbol of the Builders' might and the apex of their infinite empire, the Starforge. The Starforge was a gargantuan space station built in low orbit above Lehon's sun, from which it siphoned enormous volumes of stellar matter and solar radiation. It was equipped with energy weapons and shields for defense, countless starship hangars, and cavernous internal halls, and most importantly, it contained enormous production facilities. These could produce just about anything, from weapons and war droids to starfighters and capital ships, using only what the Starforge siphoned from Lehon's sun and the power of the dark side. Its production capabilities were functionally infinite, capable of creating limitless numbers of ships and droids. What's more, the Starforge did most of this on its own. The station was almost entirely automated, and it was built with the very finest examples of Rakatan self-repairing nanotechnology. All the Starforge required was a controller, an individual powerful enough in the dark side to bend the situation to their will. This was easier said than done. As with all Rakatan technology, the Starforge was force-based, an artifact of the dark side, and the dark side was so concentrated within it that the Starforge developed a will of its own. In many ways, it was more like a living creature than a machine, and it hungered. The Starforge fed on death, and it consumed its users, drawing on their negative emotions to feed itself. It took a being of immense power to use the Starforge. Anyone else who tried would be destroyed by the machine. Their wills would break, their minds would be consumed, and their bodies would become nothing more than empty husks. In the hands of a strong enough controller, however, the Starforge could produce an infinite armada capable of conquering the galaxy and maybe more. Once it was completed, the Infinite Empire was all but unstoppable. Its territory spanned the entire galaxy, though it didn't even come close to control of every star system in the galaxy. As we mentioned earlier, the Rakatan hyperdrive only allowed travel to worlds strong in the Force. Rather, the Infinite Empire controlled a scattered network of planets spread all across the galaxy. But there was no power left that could rival the Builders, and so the power of the Infinite Empire far exceeded any of its contemporaries. At its height, the Infinite Empire controlled over 500 systems with a combined population of 10 billion Rakata and trillions of slaves. The species enslaved by the Infinite Empire were too numerous to count. They included humanity, the Wookiees, the Selkath, the Solonians, the Drall, the Hutts, the Muns, the Dugs, the Gran, the Tals, the Duros, the Kamasai, the Zygerians, and the ancestors of the Sand People and Jawas. The homeworlds of all conquered peoples were littered with monuments to the Infinite Empire, at the heart of which were the star maps, self-repairing artifacts that could be used to view the entire expanse of the Infinite Empire, with the Starforge at its center. These star maps also acted as nexuses of the dark side, steadily corrupting the regions they were located in. For millennia, all who opposed the Builders were brutally crushed. Many planets were outright glassed by the Infinite Empire, and entire species, such as the Eshkar, were all but completely exterminated. The first exceptions to this rule were the Sith of Korriban. As we detailed in our Sith history series, the warring nations of the Sith had been united under the fearsome King Adas circa 28,000 BBY, shortly following which the Rakata discovered Korriban and sought to vassalize the Sith. But the Sith resisted all of the Builders' attempt at conquest, resulting in a centuries-long war that transformed the surface of Korriban into a wasteland of red sand. Over the course of the war, the Sith were consumed by the dark side, which they used to commandeer Rakatan technology to use against the invaders. Circa 27,700 BBY, the Sith successfully drove the Infinite Empire from Korriban, albeit at the cost of King Ardas's life, following which they developed their own small interstellar civilization. Centuries later, a similar revolt would cost the Rakata control of Tatooine, then a lush world of jungles and oceans, following which the vengeful builders bombarded the planet from orbit, turning its surface to glass. In time, the glass would break down into sand, and Tatooine would become a searing desert. As these Rakatan defeats suggested, the Infinite Empire had entered a slow but irreversible decline, caused by the very machine that had allowed the Rakata to achieve such enormous might, the Starforge. The Starforge fed on the anger and hate of its masters, their desire to conquer and hunger for power, and so it accentuated these traits within its masters so that it could feed more. The builders believed themselves strong enough to resist this effect, but they were wrong. The Starforge cast a long shadow over Lehon, corrupting the Rakata more and more with each passing generation. As the influence of the Starforge grew, the Rakata became more violent and power-hungry, and as a result, they started to turn on each other. Starting in around 26,000 BBY, the Infinite Empire began to come apart at the seams. Infighting and power struggles within Rakatan leadership intensified, with Praetors jockeying for control over newly discovered territories and undermining the Infinite Empire as a whole in the process. All of this was amplified by a growing problem within Rakatan society. Slowly but surely, the Rakata were starting to lose their force sensitivity. The causes of this are unknown. Some Rakata speculated that it stemmed from overuse of the force, while others believed that the loss was some sort of karma, a punishment the force had inflicted upon them for their atrocities. Either way, the consequences were clear. The Rakata were beginning to be blinded to the force, and this threatened their ability to use their technology. Hoping to reverse this, Praetor Skalnas tasked his Force Hounds to seek a route to the Tython system, home of the Jedi, which had previously been inaccessible to the Rakata due to the density of stars and black holes in the deep core. A Force Hound named Zesh was ultimately able to find a path through the deep core, however, and in 25,793 BBY, the forces of the Infinite Empire arrived in the Tython system at last. There, the Rakata laid waste to the settled worlds, wiping out many of the non-Jedi Tythons. But their campaign of conquest was halted by the Jedi, who led the armies of the settled worlds against the Rakata, adopting Rakatan force sabers in place of alchemically enhanced swords to use against the invaders. In the end, the Jedi managed to drive off the Rakata, but their encounter with the Infinite Empire sent shockwaves through the Order. In the Rakata, the Jedi saw the true extent of the corruption possible through the dark side, and to the horror of the Masters, the same corruption soon became evident in many of their own students. The Force sabers the Jedi had commandeered from the Rakata were tools of the dark side, and their users had to draw on the dark side to use the weapon. The more they did so, the more the dark side corrupted them. By the end of the war with the Rakata, many Jedi had begun to understand the true nature of the Force. There was no balancing the light and the dark, the Ashla and the Bogan, and the balance sought by the will of the Force required the dark side to be purged from the galaxy. This was the start of a schism that destroyed the Jedi Order, dividing it between the disciples of Ashla and the followers of Bogan. This schism blossomed into the Force Wars, which raged across Tython for close to a decade. The Force Wars of Tython were the first great clash between the light side and the dark side, and they were every bit as brutal as the many similar conflicts that followed. The followers of Ashla gave up their Force sabers and fought with Force-imbued swords, as did many of the followers of Bogan. The armies of the Bogan were led by a former Jedi Master named Daigon Lok, and they fought without mercy, giving in to the power of the dark side and letting it consume them. But under the leadership of four great masters, the followers of Ashla organized in the hope of gaining the advantage, forming a new order devoted to the teachings of the light side. They became the Jedi Knights, the champions of the light, determined to amend the mistakes of the Jedi by rejecting the darkness and using their powers to protect the weak. In the end, the Jedi Order emerged triumphant from the Force Wars. Those few followers of Bogan that survived fled to the Rim in Generation ships, and in time, the Jedi Knights would pursue them. But the cost of the conflict was high. Tython was utterly devastated, as were the settled worlds, whose populations had completely vanished between the Rakatan invasion and the Force Wars. To the Jedi, this served only as further proof to the dangers of the dark side and the necessity of defeating it. After a last conflict with dark side schismatics from within their own ranks, the Jedi Order abandoned Tython, with the Council relocating to Ossus in the Outer Rim. Meanwhile, the power struggles in the Infinite Empire mounted until a full-scale civil war erupted between the Rakata. This civil war devastated the Infinite Empire, but it was only the beginning of the end. Even as the civil war raged, a plague began to spread across Rakatan space. Its origins were unknown, but it was speculated to have been created by one of the slave species, as it only infected Rakata. Between the civil war and the plague, billions of Rakata perished. Then, in 25,200 BBY, the plague mutated with serious consequences for Rakatan society. This new mutation completely stripped the Rakata of their ability to use the Force, and it spread like wildfire across the surviving Rakatan population. Without Force sensitivity, the Rakata were unable to operate their own technology, and the Infinite Empire was crippled. Seeing opportunity, the slave species all rose up at once, driving the remaining Rakata off-world and destroying all trace of their presence. On many worlds, the Builders were completely erased from history, with only scattered ruins on more remote worlds attesting to the Infinite Empire's existence. Those Rakata that survived retreated to the unknown regions, to Lehon and the worlds of the Rakatan archipelago, where they hid from the vengeance of their former slaves. A few Rakata held out on the colonies of the archipelago, but most of the surviving Rakata returned to Lehon, where the civil war continued and grew even more brutal until the Infinite Empire finally destroyed itself. In the end, the warlords that had taken control of Rakatan society unleashed weapons of mass destruction, sparking a planet-wide nuclear war that devastated the planet. Those few Rakata that survived descended into primitivism, and their homeworld was forever transformed, with most of its great cities obliterated or lost beneath rising oceans. Over the course of millennia, all but one of the surviving Rakatan tribes forgot their history and continued to fight among themselves, and by the time of the 7th Battle of Rusan, the Rakata were extinct. The fall of the Infinite Empire was the beginning of a new era for the galaxy. The fall of the Rakata allowed the former slave species to form interstellar civilizations of their own, and many newly freed peoples across the galaxy flourished. No one civilization was able to take the place of the Infinite Empire, not for thousands of years. Of the pre-Rakatan empires, only the Gree were still around, and the steady decline of their civilization left them unable to expand beyond the half-dozen worlds of the Gree Enclave. Instead, in the post-Rakatan age, many civilizations would rise to power at once. The seeds of this new golden age for the galaxy were actually sown during the time of the Builders. During the later millennia of the Infinite Empire's reign, many of the slave species were able to reverse engineer stolen Rakatan technology, and by the time the Infinite Empire fell, many peoples had already adapted energy weapons, droids, energy shields, and in some cases even primitive hyperdrives for their own use. These civilizations were ready to build and expand the moment the Rakata retreated, which is exactly what most of them did. We've discussed a few of these people in dedicated videos about their history. The Hutts of Val, who were one of the species that had reverse engineered the Rakatan hyperdrive, established an empire of their own pretty much the moment the Infinite Empire collapsed. The Hutt Empire operated much like the Infinite Empire had, conquering anything within reach and enslaving or exterminating any alien populations it encountered. Within a century of the Infinite Empire's fall, the Hutts had established total control over a respectively large swath of the Outer Rim. Other species hadn't waited for the Infinite Empire to collapse to begin expanding across the stars. After they threw off their Rakata masters, the Sith commandeered Rakatan skip ships and used them to relocate to frigid Ziost, which became their adopted homeworld in light of Korriban's devastation. Using the Rakata's force-powered hyperdrives, the Sith also established colonies on Thule, Malachor V, Arbra, and Tund. Nearby in the Mid-Rim, the Anzati had also taken to the stars long before the Infinite Empire's fall, and they had long since begun to wander the galaxy. Around the same time that the Sith relocated to Ziost, the Hergliks of the planet Gidru invented some form of hyperspace travel and had begun to colonize worlds in the southern core. Unlike the Rakata and the Hutts, the Hergliks weren't conquerors, and when they encountered other species, they came with offers of trade and mutual defense. By the time the Infinite Empire fell, Gidru was the thriving capital of the Herglik trade empire, which controlled about a modern sector's worth of space in the southern core. Post-Rakata, the Herglik trade empire established friendly relations with the Duros and the Corellians, and they remained on good terms with their neighbors well into the time of the Republic. As we discussed in our Republic history series, the Hergliks and their allies were independent for millennia after the Republic's founding, though they eventually did join the Republic in 13,000 BBY. Also in the southern core, the Deveronians of Deveron had invented the highly dangerous Tumble hyperdrive sometime around 27,000 BBY, which the Deveronians used to wander the stars and make contact with nearby alien cultures, likely including the Hergliks. The Tumble hyperdrive was independently invented by the Gossams of Castel around the same time, and Gossam Kuravers, using Tumble Drive powered scout ships, discovered and established a Gossam colony on remote Felucia in the Outer Rim. The Tumble hyperdrive was an unstable piece of technology, however, which prevented the Deveronians and the Gossams from establishing all that many colonies. The Kill of Belnar, the Duros of Duro, and the Kamasi of Kamas, all species from the core or colonies, also began interstellar exploration shortly before or immediately after the reign of the Rakata, becoming important parts of the growing interstellar civilization in the core. But the core of that growing civilization was another species entirely: humanity. The humans of Coruscant had been one of the many species enslaved by the Rakata, but the Infinite Empire didn't keep nearly as tight a grip on them as they did for most of its other subjects, possibly because not even the Infinite Empire had the manpower to establish total control over Galactic City. Because of this, humanity had begun to spread out into the stars during the height of the Infinite Empire, with Coruscant funding expeditions that became the start of dozens of colonies all over the core. Ironically, the Rakata themselves played a large role in humanity's expansion. The builders took countless humans from Coruscant and seeded them all across the galaxy as slaves, beginning populations that would eventually evolve into dozens of near-human species. In fact, it's believed that the Celestials had started doing the same thing even before the Infinite Empire's time. Corellia's human population predated the first generation of ships sent out from Coruscant, and later scientists believed that the Corellians had been transplanted to Corellia shortly after the system was built by the Celestials. The Corellians, together with the Selonians and Drall, the other species of the Corellian system, began exploring their slice of the core at around the same time as the Hergliks did. The Corellians made contact with the Duros early on and established a strong alliance with them, and they opened up trade with the Hergliks as well. But most of the human civilizations springing up during the time of the Infinite Empire weren't Corellian colonies, but Coruscanti ones. Coruscant's first colonies were established through the use of sublight generation ships, which took centuries to reach their destinations. By the time these ships arrived, their original crews would be long dead, and settlements were instead established by their descendants, typically many generations removed. One of the systems colonized by these generation ships was the Koro system, however, where the human colonists discovered carbonite, which could be used to preserve the original crews in suspended animation until they reached their destinations, at which point the crews would be unthawed and settlement could begin. This discovery came in tandem with the invention of rudimentary dimensional drives, which could achieve FTL travel by rippling space. though they still often took decades to reach their destinations. Thus, starting in 27,500 BBY, Coruscant began sending out sleeper ships with dimensional drives and carbon-frozen crews, which established human colonies all over the core worlds. Thus, human colonies were established not just on the 7 worlds of the Empress Teta system, but also on nearby Metalos and Alsacan, as well as Axorm and Anaxis, the Rengali shell worlds, Topasi, Alderaan, Kuat, Rendili, and Corphi. Most of these human colonies developed in isolation from Coruscant. Over the course of millennia, they developed their own civilizations and cultures, and some of them even established sleeper ship colonies of their own. Kuat, for instance, established its own colony on Humbarine. These human colonies all flourished after the fall of the Infinite Empire, establishing contact with each other and with their neighbors. Connected by Corellian and Duros hyperspace cannons derived from Rakatan technology, these peoples developed a shared civilization known to history as the Human Core. But a few sleeper ships were sent out far beyond the core worlds, establishing human populations far from the borders of the Human Core. One of these ships eventually landed on Shilla in the unknown regions, and its crew's descendants became the near-human Chiss. And 2 other sleeper ships landed on Barseg and Janalis in the Tion cluster, deep in the Outer Rim, where they laid the foundation of the galaxy's other great human civilization, the Tionese. From Barseg and Janalis, the Tionese spread out across the Tion cluster. Contact with Rakatan cast-offs allowed these humans to develop their own unique hyperdrive technology, which could only travel between hyperspace beacons located at points in real space. This lighthouse network prevented the Tionese from establishing contact with the core, and within a few generations, they had forgotten their original homeworld, but it did allow the Tionese to spread out across the Tion cluster, establishing a number of proud civilizations. By 25,150 BBY, the largest of these were the Kingdom of Kron, the Kingdom of Barseg, and the Livian League. The Livian League in the north was a confederation of worlds ruled by Decevro, Livian, and Canaver, which remained fiercely independent from the squabbling kingdoms that dominated much of the cluster. To the south of the Livian League was the brutally repressive Kingdom of Barseg, which was allied with the neighbouring kingdoms of Jaminir and Cadenth. The largest of all the Tionese states was the Kingdom of Kron, which ruled from the planet Chandar. The Kronese controlled the southern edge of the Tion cluster, as well as many of the systems along the Ihara Spiral, a tangle of nebulae that would later be renamed the Indrexu Spiral. On the other side of the Ihara were the back spiral worlds, the backwaters of Tionese space. It's along the Ihara Spiral, in the remotest reaches of the Kingdom of Kron, that our last story of the pre-Republic era begins. Even as the Infinite Empire fell in the outside galaxy, a new conqueror was born on the windswept planet Argai, a man named Xur the Eighth. He grew up to be a chieftain of the pirates that plagued the Ihara Spiral, and he and his men became tremendously wealthy from their misdeeds, allowing Xur to seize power on Argai. In those days, the Kingdom of Kron was beset by political crises and petty squabbles between the lords on Chandar, and Xur took this as an opportunity to carve out part of the kingdom for himself. He annexed neighbouring Dravioin and advanced down the Ihala routes with a fleet of warships, forming the Kingdom of Argai in the Cronies' backcountry. Circa 25,150 BBY, Xur had become too powerful for the nobles on Chandar to ignore any longer. Faris, the king of Kron, attempted to buy Xur's fealty by offering him noble titles, but Xur responded by leading war fleets deep into Cronies' territory, conquering Dunabulon, Pasmin, Sorus, Barankar, and finally Chandar itself. King Faris fled, and Xur became the new king of Kron, reuniting the kingdom under his banner and taking Chandar as his new throne world. Not all of the member worlds of the Kingdom of Kron were willing to accept Xur's rule, however. Xur and his generals spent the next few years engaged in the Cronies' sweeps, brutally subjugating all the Cronies' territories until all challenges to Xur's rule had been destroyed. The most ruthless of all Xur's generals was his teenage son Xim, who proved to be a brilliant tactician and a fierce conqueror. Xim subjugated Pasmin, Nuswata, and Ibon, and before long, the whole kingdom of Kron had been united under Xur, albeit at the end of a beam tube. From there, Xur set out to conquer the rest of the Tion cluster. He moved first against the 3 allied kingdoms to the north of the kingdom of Kron, first conquering Jaminir, then Cadenth, and finally Barseg, absorbing their territories into his kingdom. The kingdom of Kron also expanded into the back spiral, conquering Kalula, Brygia, Eridan, Rudrig, and Tion before claiming the prize of the back spiral, Raxus Prime, where the Pirate King established gleaming palaces. Only the Livian League successfully resisted Xur, crushing his fleets in battle at Lorad and Amarin. Recognizing that his forces had been overextended, Xur abandoned the war with the Livian League and spent the rest of his reign building up his empire, dividing the expanded kingdom of Kron into 3 realms run from Chandar, Cadenth, and Raxus Prime. But he never gave up his ambitions to rule all the Tion cluster, and official documents stated that there were not 3 throne worlds of the kingdom of Kron, but 4: Chandar, Cadenth, Raxus, and Decivro. In 25,130 BBY, rule of the kingdom of Kron passed to Xur's son Xim, who immediately set out to finish what his father started and crush the Livian League. But the League surrendered before the assault began, knowing they stood no chance, and Xim annexed the region, finally achieving his father's dream of conquering the Tion cluster. Decivro became the 4th throne, and with its annexation, the kingdom of Kron became the Empire of Xim. And Xim, known to history as Xim the Despot, would expand his empire beyond his father's wildest dreams. Xim's next campaign began in 25,126 BBY, and it saw Tynese forces expand north from the Tion cluster, pushing out into the region the Tynese knew as the Thanium Worlds. Over the course of the next decade, Xim's armies conquered Thanium, Felucia, Mossack, Galadran, Renvar, Stenos, Arda, Lukazek, and countless other systems, with some sources claiming that Xim even conquered Korriban and Thule in Sith space. Most planets were easily crushed, but some put up a more spirited fight. The most well-known opponent of Xim was Indrexu, the infamous queen of Ranrune, whose brave resistance held off Xim's Janissaries for a time, only for a time. Eventually, Ranrune fell, but the Ihara spiral was renamed in Indrexu's honor, and the rimward stretch of Xim's empire became known as the Far Indrexu. Thanium on the Thanium world became Xim's 5th throne, while the Yutusk in the Far Indrexu became his 6th. By the time these territories had been fully incorporated into Xim's empire, the Tynese had begun to expand south as well, pushing into the region known as the Kyrium Reaches, a campaign that began in 25,120 BBY. Many planets in this region were a rich source of Kyrium, the gleaming chrome-like metal that Xim's warships were plated in, which provided protection against energy weapons. The Tynese established dozens of colonies in the Kyrium Reaches, many of which became as wealthy as the oldest throne worlds of the Tion cluster. Xim established 2 additional thrones in this region, Huranom and Astagone. As the Tynese pushed into the Kyrium Reaches, they made contact with the representatives of another civilization, the Hutt Empire. Nimbanel and Sakyan traders occasionally strayed into the edges of Tynese territory, and the stories Xim heard from them intrigued him. The Hutts had an empire that was about as large and powerful as Xim's, and they were equally ruthless conquerors. War with the Hutts would undoubtedly be hard for the Tynese to win, but from the Hutt servants, Xim knew that the Hutt Empire was also overflowing with riches, which tempted him to try anyway. As the years slowly creeped toward 25,100 BBY, Xim's scouts began steadily forging hyperspace routes toward the Hutt Empire. The borders of Xim's territory were expanded south to the remote Hutt colony of Kovari, while a secret route called the Warrior's Trace was forged around Hutt territory, ending at Kessel, known to the Tynese as Zo's Eye, which lay on the rimward borders of the Hutt Empire. Xim spent years preparing for contact with the Hutts, amassing vast armies of Janissaries, fleets of Kyrium-plated warships, and legions of powerful war droids derived from Rakatan technology. He sent numerous scouts into Hutt territory and had them interrogated by his fearsome secret police, the Geno Haradan, to ensure that every detail of what they had seen was recorded. When all was said and done, Xim made his move. Knowing the strength of the Hutt Empire, Xim didn't immediately resort to war with the Hutts. After making formal first contact with the Hutts, Xim started a round of negotiations which led to a summit on Kovari between 24 Hutt nobles and Xim's most trusted counselor, whose name is recorded in Hutt annals as Oziaf the Insignificant. The Hutts saw these humans as lesser beings, and they didn't take kindly to the presence of the Chinese diplomats. But not even the Hutts could deny how impressive Xim's empire was, so they offered to make the Chinese their most favoured slaves if they submitted to Hutt rule. Now it was Xim's turn to take offence. The Hutt's response reminded him of how the King of Kron had tried to buy the loyalty of his father, and Xim decided that he would respond in the same way his father had. Claiming the ancient Rakatan title of Daritha, meaning Conqueror of Worlds, he declared the Hutt treasure world Slaheron his 9th throne world and set out to take Hutt space by force. So began the Xim Wars. In 25,102 BBY, Xim began his assault with a two-pronged attack, sending one fleet to Kovari and another to Slaheron. The assault on Kovari was incredibly brutal, and it ended in victory for the Chinese. But this victory came at a great cost to Xim's forces, who suffered heavy casualties and had to bomb the once lush surface of Kovari into oblivion to pry it from the Hutts' hands. Nonetheless, Xim was able to plant his flag on the barren surface of Kovari, which the Chinese used as a staging ground for raids into the nearby Siklata cluster. The assault on Slaheron, however, ended disastrously. Hutt forces had kept the Chinese engaged at Kovari for long enough they were able to send reinforcements to their fleets at Slaheron, and Xim's second fleet was ultimately driven back to Zhou's Eye, where most of the Chinese ships were lost amidst the black holes of the Maw cluster. These losses were a blow to Xim's empire, and the Hutts capitalized on them by hiring privateers of all stripes to harass Chinese shipping, preventing further incursions into Hutt territory for a time. In 25,100 BBY, as the war ground to a stalemate, Xim received a message from the Hutt general Cossack, who called the despot a coward and challenged him to a ritual battle above Vontor in the contested Siklata cluster. Xim accepted the challenge and sent his best fleet to Vontor, but Xim's forces lost the first battle of Vontor, and in response, the Hutts demanded that Xim withdraw from Kovari and the other occupied Hutt worlds. Xim refused. Instead, he directed his forces to step up their raids on the Siklata cluster, and he even ordered a second assault on Hutt space itself, supporting the Parliament of Morolan in throwing off Hutt rule and becoming a Taiwanese-aligned republic. Morolan opened up another front in the war, one in which the Taiwanese didn't have to do any fighting of their own, which Xim believed would give him an advantage. Thus, when Cossack challenged him to a second ritual battle at Vontor the next year, Xim accepted, believing he would have an advantage. To stack the odds in his favor, Xim chose to fight in the ground, sending his elite Dunabolon Star Lancers to crush the Hutt's vassal armies. But the second battle of Vontor didn't go the way Xim had expected, and the Hutts came out on top once again. The battle wasn't a total loss, however, as Xim had managed to pillage a horde of Kyrium from Vontor before his army's defeat. By this point, Xim's commanders were beginning to doubt their prospects in the war, and the Taiwanese command structure started to fracture. Taiwanese shipping was in disarray due to the actions of Hutt privateers, and Xim nearly bankrupted the empire rebuilding his armies after the second battle of Vontor. To buy himself time, Xim ceded Morolan back to the Hutts, but this ploy didn't work. The Hutts simply sterilized Morolan and proceeded to attack Kovari, recapturing the planet from the Taiwanese. In 25,096 BBY, Xim received a challenge to a third ritual battle at Vontor. This time, Cossack promised that the Hutts would cede Kovari and Morolan back to the Taiwanese if they won, but demanded the entirety of the Kyrium Reaches should they lose. Xim accepted the challenge, as his army of war robots had finally been completed, and he believed these would prove unstoppable on the battlefield. But when the day of the Third Battle of Vontor dawned, the Hutts revealed a secret weapon of their own. They had promised the species of the Klata cluster, who Xim had subjected to constant raids, protection from the Tynese in exchange for eternal servitude. The Nikto, the Vodrans, and the Klatunians had accepted, and the Hutts immediately gathered millions of slave soldiers from each species to deploy on the battlefields of Vontor. The numbers of these new Hutt slaves were sufficient to absolutely massacre the Tynese at Vontor. The Hutts were utterly victorious in the Third Battle of Vontor, and in the end, Xim the Despot was captured and hauled back to Val for a public trial, in which Cossack the Hutt condemned him to languish in a Hutt dungeon for the rest of his life. Xim died in captivity shortly thereafter, and his empire fractured. In its time, the empire of Xim the Despot had been the largest empire in the entire galaxy, larger in terms of territory than both the Hutt Empire and the Human Core. But Xim had squandered it all in war with the Hutts, draining the empire's treasuries and leading its fleets to their doom. And with Xim captured by the Hutts, it didn't take long for the Despot's empire to splinter. Within a decade, the Tion cluster was once more divided between warring states, squabbling over what was left of their lost glory. The cluster itself became divided between the much-reduced kingdom of Kron, the Jamanium Archers, and the honorable union of Decivero and Tion, the latter of which would start a war with the Republic. The outlying territories Xim had conquered were abandoned or broke off, becoming backwater satrapies. The inner reaches of the Thanium worlds became their own state, while the Indrexu Confederation and Keldrath alignment formed in the far Indrexu. The once wealthy Kyrium reaches became a borderland between the Tynese and the Hutts, which the Hutts spent centuries pillaging before choosing to sterilize the entire region in a genocidal campaign known as the Devouring. It was only downhill for the Tynese from there. But even as the Tynese were plunged into a dark age, their relatives halfway across the galaxy were faring much better. In 25,053 BBY, Corellian and Duro scientists invented the modern hyperdrive, revolutionizing space travel across the human core. This sparked a brief period of war as power-hungry conquerors sought to exploit this new innovation to conquer and build empires for themselves. But they were opposed by a new alliance built on trade and pluralism, which was led into battle by Jedi Knights and marched under banners marked with the 8-spoked symbol of the Order of Dai Bendu. In the end, the forces of evil were defeated, and all the peoples of the human core each sent representatives to Coruscant, where they chose to establish a new government of which they would each be equal members. This new government was the Galactic Republic, and with its formation, our story finally comes to an end. Well, that's the entire history of the pre-Republic era. We hope you've enjoyed this exploration of one of Star Wars' most fascinating time periods. But what do you think? Which pre-Republic civilization do you think was the most interesting? Let us know all that and more in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.